I just finished doing an interview with Global TV Calgary about a speech given by OPEC Secretary General Haitham al-Ghais at the Global Energy Show. So here's what he had to say. Simply put, ladies and gentlemen, there is no peak oil demand on the horizon. The fact that oil demand keeps rising, hitting new records year on year, is a clear example of what I'm saying. Okay, I get problems with this. And in a minute, I'll explain to you how they relate to Alberta and Premier Danielle Smith. But let's start with the fact that every year, OPEC puts out the World Oil Outlook, where basically they model the future out to 2050, and they do, computer modeling, data modeling. So one of the smartest things that ever said to me by an economist was Dr. Chris Bataille, who said, all good modelers state their assumptions up front. And I've read the OPEC last couple of studies, and they're very clear about what their assumptions are. And that's where the problem lies. And that's what's wrong with Haitham al-Ghais' speech, is the OPEC's assumptions have so many holes in them, they're like Swiss cheese. And I could go through, half a dozen, but the big one is they are counting on the emerging economies of the global south to provide demand for oil well past 2050. And they think that the global auto fleet is going to increase from its current 1.6 billion to 2.9 billion, and by 2050, that the 70% of those vehicles will still be gas powered. They think that climate policy is going to be weakened, not strengthened. They think that clean energy technology like EVs is going to stay too expensive. There's a lot of really, I think, errors in their assumptions. But the big one is the electrification of transportation that China is driving. And you'll remember last year that then President Joe Biden put on 100% tariffs on Chinese EV imports into the US, effectively ending them. And Canada followed suit in September. And China took a look at that and went, okay, if you won't take our product, then we're going to sell down into the global south. And so the exports to Latin America, Africa, and they have just exploded. I mean, they're just millions and millions of them, and they're building plants, and they're setting up assembly plants. So you just send down a car knocked down, and then local workers will put the pieces together into a car. None of that shows up in the OPEC modeling. In fact, the only thing that they say about China, the only time China is referenced is with respect to its oil demand. So they think that actually between now and 2050, Chinese oil demand will rise by 4 million barrels a day. What do the Chinese think? Well, there's the China National Petroleum Corporation says that peak oil demand in China is coming next year. Sinopec, the big state-owned refiner, says next year. Now, I would assume that, those kinds of organizations being in China, knowing the market as well as they do, are probably a little more accurate than OPEC. The OPEC is off by like 24 years. This is the kind of problem that you see over and over again in the modeling. So while Haitham al-Ghais may stand up and say no peak oil demand coming, other studies say differently. Now, here's where Danielle Smith comes in. In 2023, September of 2023, the World Petroleum Congress was held in Calgary. And I reported on it for 3 days, and I attended a press conference that Smith gave. And I got a couple questions in, and I said, she was saying, no reputable forecaster is calling for peak oil demand by 2030, and then maybe not even 2050. And one of as an energy journalist, one of my hobbies is actually reading oil demand modeling. And I can tell you that there are a couple like OPEC. OPEC's the most extreme, but there are a couple that kind of agree with OPEC. There are plenty, way more, that agree that oil demand is going to peak in 2030. And so I pointed this out to the Premier, and I said, that contradicts what arguments you were making. And she just fluffed it off and didn't really answer the question. So my follow-up was, said, if the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is right, and there is peak oil demand and then it starts to decline in the early 2030s, I mean, that would be disastrous for Alberta. I said, what's the plan B? And she, again, fluffed an answer and be very clear that there was no plan B. Okay, so this is the problem, is that OPEC is telling, basically the oil industry in Canada, that don't worry about it. There's lots of oil demand out to 2050. And the Premier is on board with OPEC. Once you've read the modeling, and once you read their narrative, their press releases and their speeches and so on, you recognize that Danielle Smith is essentially parroting OPEC. That's where she gets all of her ideas from. And she doesn't bother with any of the others. And that's a problem, because essentially what she's doing is she's rolling the dice that OPEC is right. And if OPEC is wrong, I guess she trusts in that the Canadian oil and gas CEOs, they believe it, she believes it, everybody believes it, they're all in their little bubble, and nobody ever contradicts each other. And as a journalist, I get Alberta government press releases, and I can't tell you the volume of pro-oil and gas. I mean, it's nothing more than tub thumping. Yesterday it was all about Alberta drillers are the best in the world, and today it was all about how Alberta is the biggest energy supplier to the G7 countries, because they're meeting in Kananaskis soon. So on and on and on and on it goes. And her worldview, her view of the future, is very, like Haitham al-Ghais, is very much like driving in the rearview mirror. And all of these trends that show, that lead the IEA to conclude that oil will peak in 2030, just ignores them, completely ignores them. And I should point out that 45% of that demand comes from road transport. So 27% from light duty vehicles kind of stuff, cars and trucks that we drive, and then the rest would be from medium duty, like delivery vans, and then the heavy duty, the long haul trucks. Well, China is busy electrifying its entire transportation sector. They've got something like 700,000 buses, electric buses already. And this year, about 65% of their new car sales are going to have a plug. I mean, China is driving the electrification of the transportation sector, and it doesn't even show up in OPEC modeling. So it's no wonder that the Secretary General thinks that no peak oil demand. If you ignore the trends that don't agree with you, then of course you come up with your own conclusion. But Danielle Smith agreeing, that's rolling the dice. Rolling the dice. A less risky strategy would be to begin looking at new uses for bitumen, which is most of what Alberta exports. For instance, I say this all the time, the Alberta Innovates is a year or two away from having a process to turn bitumen into carbon fiber, or into activated chemical carbon, or asphalt binder. I mean, a prudent government and prudent industry would say, you know what, this is a time of intense change, and we need to have a backup plan. And we need to begin to diversify our economy, diversify the things that we do with oil. Simply sending it to refineries and the odd bit to petrochemical complexes is not enough. We have to plan for the future, because it takes 10, 15, 20 years to build an industry, to be able to process bitumen at scale and maybe take some or most of what Alberta produces on a daily basis. So you need to start today to plan for the future. And in my opinion, based on all of the modeling that I've read, I think the International Energy Agency is correct. And I think the announced policy scenario, because they have 3 of them, but the middle one, the APS, is the most likely. And that calls for peak oil demand in 2030, and about 2032, 2033 is when you begin to see decline. And by the time you get to 2050, oil demand is only 57 million barrels a day. It's not quite half, it's about 60% of what it is today. Well, Alberta's in big trouble if the APS scenario is the most likely future that Alberta is looking at. So my comment today is exactly the same as it was in 2023. Where is the plan B?